I think there's going to be a lot of people curious as to why I'm looking at a ancient and mostly dead online game here. Oftentimes these older online games get harder and harder to take a realistic, accurate look at as time goes on. In this case, the first obvious reason I'm doing this video is because the day this video comes out is the 20th anniversary of the game. And of course, I scheduled in order to hit that, but there's more to it. At its core, ever since I first played this 20 years ago, I've believed that Guild Wars has a lot of value outside of its MMO-esque trappings. Obviously, if you can find people to play with, that's gonna be a way to increase the enjoyment you're gonna get out of it, like any multiplayer game. But for me, the guild versus guild, or PvP, wasn't what was the most important part of this game. What was important to me was its core character action gameplay, something I think is still worth taking a look at in 2025. I tried to approach starting this off in a sort of pure way. I didn't look up any guides or anything when choosing the route I was going down when it came to choosing my class. I certainly could have gone for the min-maxing route of finding a really great build and going with that, and there were certainly times later while I was playing where, in peak frustration, I certainly wished I had gone down that route. But the truth of the matter is that I had a vague memory of playing a very minion-focused necromancer/monk when this game first came out 20 years ago, and that is fully the direction I decided on going in again. Something else that's very important to note when it comes to how I approach this game is that I am fully laser-focused on the version of this game that came out 20 years ago, which is to say, I am very focused on the original Prophecies campaign. We don't have the time to look in depth at the later and, honestly, sometimes better campaigns from the other expansions, but I will talk about them a little bit because they will absolutely come up occasionally. The first thing that really surprised me was that after going and grabbing the Guild Wars client off the ArenaNet website, using my still active old account, I had absolutely no problem getting the game running on a modern PC. Now, there are a few pain points. The game was designed with the intent that it would stream data to you as you play, which was a great idea for reducing the initial download burden in an era where a lot of people were still playing on lower-end connections like dial-up or maybe at best DSL, but these days it's a bit of a burden because the servers are very much in legacy mode and serve up those files very slowly. There is, thankfully, a way to force the client to just download all the files with a launch parameter, and I highly recommend doing that in the background while you do other things on your computer instead of depending on the data streaming in order to have the best experience while actually playing and not having to sit through a ton of downloads during load screens. The total amount of data you have to download to have the entire game's assets local is not even a particularly large amount by today's standards. The game mostly works fine on modern systems, but there are a few problems here and there. Perhaps the most notable is only at its most relevant if you're running a 4K display, as it makes the UI elements incredibly tiny, even at the in-game preset of larger for the elements. I had to spend a ton of time adjusting the size of individual pieces of the UI to make it bearable, but I did eventually get there. Logging in for the first time reminded me of how impressed I was by the visuals of Guild Wars back at the release, especially when compared to the big budget paid MMOs of the day. And in some ways, they have aged a little poorly, especially when it comes to things that are generally lower quality in any game, like the ground textures. Overall, however, the game still looks perfectly fine, and some environments still look downright impressive at times, especially in a world where MMOs are generally still not really expected to be among the most visually impressive games out there. Comparing Guild Wars to a mainline MMO in any meaningful way, however, is a bit fraught. And that's because despite the sort of general public perception at the time that put this game in direct competition with things like World of Warcraft, which had just come out 5 months prior in North America, Guild Wars takes a very different approach. The most notable, and impactful to the rest of the review, is that Guild Wars does not have one giant open world where you constantly run into other players. Instead, you'll only run into other players not in your party in towns and outposts. The second you leave to go run quests out in the world, it's just you and any other players that happen to be in your party. However, this approach, which allowed for a lot fewer servers with lower overall overhead in terms of cost, meant that ArenaNet could also do something else that the vast majority of MMOs wouldn't have dared in 2005. Decline to charge a monthly subscription, which definitely became a huge selling point for the game. All you have to do is make a few sacrifices here and there in terms of the traditional MMO experience, and in return, you don't have to pay a subscription every month. Of course, their server costs weren't exactly zero either, so they still needed a way to fund those, as well as the sort of regular updates that people had already come to expect back from multiplayer games even in 2005. Their plan? Release expansions at a serious clip and charge full price for each. In a preview for the first expansion, Factions, in the February 2006 issue of Computer Gaming World, it's mentioned offhandedly that they expected to put out as many as 2 expansions a year in order to keep everything running. Something that never got off the ground and was eventually abandoned entirely in favor of just pivoting to Guild Wars 2. Now, with that extensive amount of context out of the way, it's finally time for me to talk about the game itself. The first fantastic thing that Guild Wars pulls off is presenting you with what seems like a straightforward narrative of heroes fighting against seemingly impossible odds, albeit with a threatening undertone that everything is about to end, but you'd still expect those heroes to overcome the odds, like any fantasy heroes tend to do. So it comes as a pretty big surprise when, after spending a good number of hours in this very nice pastoral landscape fighting various enemies, a major story event basically brings an end to it all. The searing happens, permanently scorching the entire area you've been playing in up until that point. This was a huge shock to me when I first played Guild Wars at release, and in fact, as far as I can recall, I'm not even sure I was vaguely aware of the twist beforehand, which I'm actually sort of envious of today, where I knew exactly what was coming and exactly when it was coming. Even with that knowledge looming over my head the whole time, though, from a modern context with many more RPGs under my belt, it still strikes me on a great twist on what was very much the standard tone of MMOs and most high fantasy type RPGs in general at the time. After the searing happens, it's also great to immediately see what has happened to all the areas you've just been exploring. But the burned out, desolate landscape gets really tiring in very short order. Thankfully, after a few more hours, the game does eventually have some color return to it as you leave the seared area, starting with your arrival to the Shiver Peaks, and it more or less completely abandons the desolate tones of those areas from there on out. Now, that sort of linear story talk in an MMO was indeed very much out of place at the time. Even comparatively more accessible games like World of Warcraft, while they had a lot of quests that would help guide you through each zone, had very little resembling a coherent through line forming a linear plot, but Guild Wars very much does. After the Searing, the game's plot slowly progresses as you find new towns and outposts, which direct you to other towns and outposts, basically through to the end of the story. Towns are just hubs to meet other players, and while there are some major cities like Lion's Arch, most just serve as fast travel points and places to park quest givers that hand out quests for you to complete in the instanced world you have to traverse between the hubs. Mission outposts, however, serve as the primary form of progression through the game's main plot, as they serve for the starting point of missions. These usually start off in the early game as occasional punctuation on longer periods of open exploration, where you complete smaller quests in the game's more open areas, but as time goes on, they basically become the only real form of interacting with the story. And the open bits mostly just become traversal, with occasional, scattered, unrelated fetch quests. Each of these linear missions has a primary objective and a hidden secondary objective that you either have to discover on your own or just go look up. And frankly, like a lot of games of its ilk, I would highly recommend just going and looking up exactly what these secondary objectives are and deciding for yourself whether you think the extra time and trouble are worth it. As I mentioned previously, towns and outposts are shared with other players, but outside of those walls, it's all your own private instance that you share with the others in your party, whether that's the outpost missions or the open areas you traverse to get from one place to another. While that means you never see anyone else running around, it also means you miss out on the sort of emergent moments that you often get in other MMOs. No one is going to miraculously come to your rescue, and you won't be coming to anyone's either. That being said, the world doesn't feel empty at all as a result of that. In fact, the sheer number of enemies out in the world makes you feel almost a little bit too overcrowded. Hiking between outposts and towns can sometimes feel tedious as a result, though you won't necessarily need to constantly make the trip due to the game's fast travel allowing instantaneous trips to any place you've already visited without any cost. As with much of Guild Wars, however, the problem with such reliance on a small team of people alongside you, with no one else showing up out in the world, is that there's hardly anyone else playing anymore. Right this second, as I wrap up this script, there's a pretty big community of people trying to get everybody together for the anniversary, so right now is actually the exception to the rule. But generally speaking, if you come to the game in a few months, or played it a few months ago as I did, you almost certainly will have to play with at least some henchmen, unless you can find 7 other people to play with you in the later missions. Earlier missions require groups of 4 or 6, but eventually you'll need 8 total party members. These henchmen are, in my experience, more or less serviceable. Sure, they'll make some boneheaded moves sometimes, but for the most part they do what you need them to, especially if you direct them, including quickly rezzing you when appropriate. Of course, you can't just res infinitely because that would eliminate some of the intended challenge, so Guild Wars attempts to prevent you from doing that with death sickness that slowly goes away the more elites that you kill. The problem with this mechanic is that the only way you can completely reset this debuff is by visiting a town or outpost, and sometimes you will be very far away from one, forcing you to go back, then drag yourself all the way out to where you were again, fighting a ton of respawned enemies on your way out there. Later expansions do make this better, with the introduction of heroes, where you can fully control their skills and skill points, and they just frankly feel more powerful in general. If you have other level 20 characters on your account, it actually becomes even less of an issue, since you can, with a microtransaction, bring these characters along as members in your party after registering them as mercenaries. I highly recommend buying the full package of expansions even if you are only interested in playing Prophecies. The ability to use even just the one gimme hero, Mox, which is made available to you once you progress enough in the Prophecy story, is incredibly helpful and will save you a ton of headache if you're playing with henchmen. even if that is the only thing I did that was outside of the core Prophecies experience, it was fully worth it. As I write this, and likely as of the publishing of this video, that full package is incredibly cheap, but even at its normal price, I think it's perfectly reasonable. While we've talked a lot about the structure of the game itself so far at a pretty high level, we've barely touched on how it actually plays, and that's frankly another interesting thing about Guild Wars. The Diablo inspiration is extremely evident basically everywhere. Combat is laser focused on having a very limited number of skills on a skill bar that you build out through assigning points to different skills, and then just applying them to enemies in combinations that synergize together. Now, it is much slower than you'd expect in an ARPG in order to account for the latency inherent to an MMO, and detached from the fact that the studio behind the game, ArenaNet, was founded by 3 important ex-Blizzard employees that were very tied to Diablo in people's minds then and now, you could certainly say that this combat system is also similar to a lot of other RPGs at the time. But that inspiration doesn't stop there, and is also very clear in the movement the game has. Now, you can use the usual WASD controls like you would in most third-person games to move around, or, in what is clearly the method the game prefers, you can just click on the ground to go to that spot on the ground. Approaching movement in such a transparently two-dimensional way does have its drawbacks in a fully 3D game, though, the most noticeable of which is the lack of jumping. This seemingly small missing feature put me off back when Guild Wars was first released, and it still puts me off now, maybe even more than it did back then. That surface level thing is representative of only having very prescriptive paths through environments. If you get to the edge of a cliff, you can't just jump off. You can't fall off. You just hit an invisible wall. This can not only be annoying in the moment, but can make navigating environments an enormous pain. In fact, you'll spend a lot of time in environments just trying to figure out how to get to your destination. And there were certain moments when I was incredibly frustrated that I couldn't just take a slightly too steep path where an invisible wall existed, instead of just taking the incredibly long way around like the game wanted me to. Unfortunately, the movement is also just a single element of a game that feels kind of creaky due to its age in a lot of other ways as well. The most constantly frustrating is the way that there must be some sort of legacy latency correction code or something of that nature. If you're running along and you perform an action, whether you want to change course or grab an item, cast a spell, whatever, your character jerks backwards, like it wasn't actually at the place that you thought you were. It does this consistently and constantly in a way that is extremely obnoxious, though never game-breaking. Just one of those things that's always aggravating. As a game mostly made prior to the release of World of Warcraft, and also made with a heavy focus on the Diablo games mechanically, Guild Wars in general does not shy away from the grind that was so common among earlier MMOs. You'll need to grind for money and mats pretty regularly in order to be able to consistently gear up. And gearing up is the primary point of this game. You will hit the level cap of 20 pretty quickly, far from the end of even the game's main story quests. And from there, it's about getting new skills and optimizing both your gear and your build. Some armor will come from cities in exchange for just money, which is to say the game's primary currency. But when it comes to weapons, you'll often have to find collectors that require a certain number of items to be traded in, generally from enemies in their general area. You can, of course, wait for gear to drop, but since the best gear is going to be specific to certain skills within your class that you might not even be using, that would likely be even more of a grind, unless you get incredibly lucky. Now, when it comes to the linear plot that the game has within Prophecies, it's got a lot of momentum in the first half or so. It's pretty darn interesting, but it completely sputters out about 3/4 of the way in, where it finds you running through the desert doing missions in order to achieve some seemingly nebulous goal of ascension. That's also, not so coincidentally, the point where the difficulty spikes pretty hard in a very frustrating way, especially if you're playing with henchmen. That being said, while I'm not directly covering them here, each of the available expansions for Guild Wars has its own fun campaign to play. If you've enjoyed your time with the Prophecies campaign, honestly, I would wholeheartedly recommend you find yourself starting to stall out a bit in any of the campaigns, just try another one. This not only helps you avoid burning out, but it allows you to potentially build up new mercenaries to help you out in the campaign you're stuck in. All in all, I think no matter what the game looks like in terms of population once the hype around its anniversary calms down, Guild Wars is absolutely, despite its rough edges, still a game worth a look in 2025. Its combat, for the most part, still feels absolutely fantastic. And while the maps can sometimes be a little frustrating to navigate, there are plenty of guides out there, like any MMO, that can help you get through the worst of it. It looks more than good enough, and despite some occasional hiccups in various places, its structure feels just as relevant now as it did 20 years ago. If you can wrangle together enough friends, or find some otherwise willing people somewhere online, it is a joy to play with other people. But even if you can't, the most modern version of the game has built out some systems to help with that, and I think you'll still have a fantastic time.